Hello, this is Aaron Wissner of Local Future. I'm here on the line today with Richard Heinberg of the Post Carbon Institute. How are you doing today, Richard?
I'm doing pretty well. And how about you, Aaron?
I'm doing very well, thank you. There has been a film that came out on Earth Day 2020 called Planet of the Humans, made by Jeff Gibbs with the support of Michael Moore. And there's been a whole lot of people within the environmental community and even outside of it that have been kind of taking sides on this. What's your perspective, Richard, on this film and the whole idea that's presented by the film? And maybe
Right.
first you could just summarize what is Jeff's point as you see it?
Well, Jeff's point is, well, really two claims. One is that renewable energy is a sham. And the second is that the major environmental organizations, particularly in the US, have been more or less taken over by billionaire investors, mostly in having to do with renewable energy. And I'm interviewed in the film. I'm sort of one of the good guys. The film is very confrontational, as most of Michael Moore's films are, and he really, Jeff Gibbs, the director, really skewers some of the big environmental organization leaders in the U.S., including Bill McKibben, who has written a couple of pieces rebutting the attacks on him in the film. But as I say, I'm in the film, a couple of clips and not a lot of airtime, but I have to say the interviews that were conducted in my backyard were done in 2009. So it's really old material. And I really wish they had enabled me in some way to have some input into the film as it was being put together, because there's a lot of silly mistakes in the film, in the documentary, that didn't need to be there and really reduced what could have been the value of the film. I think the film still has value. I recommend that people see it because there's a conversation that needs to be had here about the environmental movement and where it's going and what premises we're using to make our arguments. But that discussion gets short-circuited by needless ad hominem attacks in the film, and by just plain inaccuracy with regard to stuff that's been pretty well researched by teams and teams of scientists.
It sounds like you're suggesting that the film is a commentary on facts, but the commentary isn't necessarily entirely logically consistent.
Yeah. I mean, the big claim I think that the film makes that is really worth discussing is that the environmental movement, particularly again in the United States, has attached itself to a kind of techno-fix perspective on
Techno-utopia.
Yeah, techno-utopia. If we just get the right energy sources, if we just invest in green technology, we can continue living pretty much the way we do now. We don't have to have any more of those uncomfortable discussions like we were having back in the 70s and 80s about consumption and population. And in fact, the film is being attacked as being, eco-fascist and racist, because it brings up the subject of population. And actually, I did that in the film. I think I said the essence of our problem is we have too many people using too much too fast. Okay, well, I still think that's a pretty accurate summary of our human dilemma here on planet Earth in the 21st century. But several prominent eco writers said, "Oh, you can't talk about population. You're a North American white male. And of course, most of the population growth is occurring in poor countries in Southern Hemisphere. So, you know, any discussion about population is inherently, therefore, fascist and racist. And from my perspective, if we can't talk about the elephant in the room, then what do we talk about? You know, and well, one of our fellows at Post Carbon Institute is a guy named Bill Ryerson, who runs the Population Media Center, and they work with creative people all throughout sub-Saharan Africa and other global South countries to develop communications to increase the power of girls and women in these societies. And that's been proven to be the most effective way of reducing fertility rates. And what that does is it raises the prospects of people within these societies. If they have smaller families, they can afford to educate their children more and so on. Is that somehow racist or fascist? I don't get it. I think it all stems back to the 1994 Cairo population summit, where there was a truce. You know, previously, you know, the rich countries had been talking about overpopulation as an ecological or environmental problem, and the poor countries of the global South had said, no, the problem is overconsumption, which is taking place in countries like the United States. And so at the summit, they kind of came to a tacit agreement. You know, the rich countries said, well, if you stop talking about overconsumption, then we won't talk about population anymore. And the poor countries said, okay, that's fine. We won't talk about overconsumption anymore. And so here we are, you know, the two twin problems that are, you know, erasing the prospects of future generations are off the table. So what do we talk about instead? Renewable energy, which, yeah, it's not that renewable energy shouldn't be talked about, but if that's our only way of solving our global ecological crisis, then, you know, it's not going to happen. It's not going to be solved.
So this brings up several thoughts regarding after viewing the film. You said you think it's worthwhile. I've seen the film, you've seen the film. A lot of people obviously have seen this film already on YouTube. It had, I think, 2 or 3.
Yeah, 3 or 4 million people have seen it now.
The few thoughts that this brings to mind, number one, regarding population, writer Daniel Quinn, in many of his books, talked a lot about population and the food race, and how it was really a race between the more food there is in any ecosystem, the more that population is going to grow. So if there's more food for the deer, the more deer there will be. And people don't like that argument because they don't like being compared to another animal. So that's the first thought. The second thought is Homo giganticus, which is the humans that we are, but we're able to apply a huge amount of energy in our life by our economic activity. So our spending, basically, 50,000 a year, 20,000 a year, 100,000 a year, that makes us into Homo giganticus, which has a huge impact, much more than any single individual ever was able to in the past. 2 other thoughts. One, overshoot in carrying capacity. And I was just talking with another person yesterday, Nicole Foss, about this, that in East Africa, Southern Asia, Southern Middle East, Syria, these sorts of places, the population is really much higher than the carrying capacity of the land. And so it's an overshoot situation. And that ties into the population. And the last one is just capitalism in general, and the feeling of greed and we deserve this stuff, and selfishness. And honestly, what I think it comes down to is a fear of death, ultimately, that people can't deal with their mortality to a certain extent. So how do we extend this conversation from here? What are your thoughts on all this?
Yeah, well, you just named a whole bunch of things we could talk about for a long
Well,
time.
pick on whatever you think
Yeah,
is.
I like this fear of death thing. There's a new school of psychology, fairly new school of psychology, and it's called, I'm trying to remember now, the terror management theory.
I've heard of it.
And it's all about how our fear of death, organizes our whole, social psychology. By developing intelligence during human evolution, by developing extreme intelligence, and especially language, where we can talk about things and ask questions and speculate about how things came to be and what happens next and so on, we became aware of our own death in a way that other animals aren't. And so this invokes terror, the realization that everything I know will cease to exist at some point. Once this individual perspective vanishes, it's like the end of this world, right?
For those without faith.
Yeah, right. And so we develop faith, we develop religions as a way of convincing ourselves that there's something more, that there's something beyond individual death, and maybe when you die, there's pie in the sky when you die, as the old song says. And terror management theory impacts us in other ways. We've developed the capacity for denial, like climate denial. Climate is a kind of looming death of the way we currently live, and maybe even for the planet. But we can't talk about that because it's just too scary. So we exercise our denial muscle, which we developed all the way back then, along, tens of thousands of years ago. When we developed language, we started to develop this denial muscle to deny death. And now we can apply it to problems like climate change or overpopulation or overconsumption. And we've gotten really good at it. We exercise that muscle all the time, and it's just ready and waiting anytime we get into a bind. And it's only when there's something, staring us right in the face that we can't deny, that we, have to deal with reality. Near the moment of our own personal death, I mean, people have lucid moments where suddenly things come into perspective, and during this pandemic, you can't wish it away. You can't pretend it's not happening. You have to deal with it. And so this is causing a lot of profound psychological disruption and realization on the part of a lot of people, as they're, understanding that there are limits to what human beings can do. There are limits to economic growth. There's actually something more important than the economy, which is survival. If bringing the economy back up, so we can all, go to the football game and so on, means that tens of thousands of people die. Well, is it worth doing that? But that's the question we already had with climate change. If we grow the economy, and that means the climate change and the extinction of species and the possibility of future generations of humans not having a habitable planet, is it worth growing the economy then? We should have been having that discussion for the last 20 years, but we didn't, because we were able to not deny that one, because it wasn't staring us right in the face. It wasn't right there. But now suddenly we realize, yeah, there is something more important than economic growth. So yeah, that's my take on denial and death.
I find it interesting that Jeff, in his film, in the very center, which is typically like the climax of a documentary, he sits down with an evolutionary psychologist or something like that, and he
Right.
has this discussion about the fear of death. And whether or not his film is looked at as entirely factual, or how much of it's commentary, or how much of it's outdated, I think some of the general themes are still worthwhile. And what do you think about that?
Oh yeah, and the guy he interviewed, I forget his name, but he's one of the key theoreticians on terror management theory. So I was really glad to see that that was included in the film. I mean, that could have been the whole film, really, just that discussion and amplifying it and looking at the implications. But unfortunately, it wasn't. And in order to be a real Michael Moore film, of course, they had to find some bad guys to tear down from their pedestal, including people like Bill McKibben, great American environmental writer, head of 350.org, and author of the End of Nature and other wonderful books.
Well, I think
that was just that was a cheap shot, really. It was very unfortunate that they chose him, Jeremy Grantham, and a couple of other people as, to just take pot shots at, rather than engaging in a real discussion, which needs to happen. I mean, there are things that I disagree with Bill McKibben about, and I would love to have that discussion, but that's not the discussion that the film engenders. Instead, it's a discussion about, are these environmental leaders, really, taking money from the Koch brothers on the sly or something, which is not, it's just not true. That's not what's happening. There may be cases of big environmental groups that have, sold themselves out to billionaire investors, but I don't think that's true of Bill McKibben. And so why waste the opportunity to have a needed discussion, to have one that's just not needed at all?
it reminds me a lot of when you have a herd animal, a flock animal, a pack, maybe not packs, but more herds, and you have one that calls an alert, and the alert is called, and except in our civilization, we don't necessarily know the alert. And some people, like Jeff, has known this stuff. He interviewed you said in 2009-ish. So he knew this, but he, for whatever reason, wasn't able to get this into the mainstream conversation. So whether he did it in the right way or the wrong way, if we could have went back and said, hey, you should have changed this or changed that, and maybe delayed the film another year, here we are now. So how do we move forward?
Right. Yeah, that's a tough one, because
people are angry. A lot of people
are angry. It's polarized people. It's just like, we're already polarized with red states and blue states. And now we've got the environmental community that's polarized around, is renewable energy the be all and the end all, or is it a distraction? And somehow we've got to have the conversation that the movie was trying to bring about.
Even if the method is not, even if the method wasn't,
yeah, even if the messenger was speaking the wrong language and being kind of a jerk, nevertheless, the message is important, and we can't just bat it away and say, oh, nobody should watch this movie because it makes these mistakes. No, let's watch the movie and have that discussion. And what I've been trying to, I wrote a review of the movie published on resilience.org, and what I've been trying to do with a lot of my writings in the last few years, especially a book that I wrote with David Fridley of Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, was look at renewable energy, very carefully in a non-dispassionate way, or in a dispassionate way, and see just what it's capable of, what a transition to 100% solar and wind future would really require, what it would look like, and so on. I see that as a contribution to the discussion. It's not the be all, and it's not the end of the discussion, but it's a contribution. So I want to be part of that discussion. It's a discussion that needs to happen. Let's engage.
So as we wrap up here, people that have seen the film on either side might be in a state of fear or denial or a feeling of helplessness now, because they don't know the way forward, because they thought this techno utopia was the way forward and now they're not sure. What can they turn their attention to then that's an alternative to this techno utopia that perhaps is more realistic?
Right. Well, you know, we have to turn the gaze back to ourselves and our community and what it means to be a human being without all this stuff. You know, maybe we're looking toward a future with a lot less technology. You know, all of this technology requires energy, regardless of what technology we're talking about. It takes energy. There are a few technologies like solar panels and wind turbines that capture energy and produce, you know, more energy than they require. But nevertheless, you know, on the whole, we're just using a whole shitload of energy, particularly in the United States. What does a future look like with less? And we're running that experiment right now with the pandemic, because our oil consumption has gone down by maybe 20%. Our electricity consumption is down. It used to be more industrial and less household. Now it's more household and less industrial. We're reorganizing how we use energy as we speak. What does this mean? You know, how do we maintain human well-being as we reduce our consumption and reduce our vulnerability to the virus? You know, it's part of this is just observation, looking around us and seeing what's actually going on, and then, you know, thinking about, well, how could we do this better? And I think that makes more sense than, you know, just you know, sort of pure philosophizing. We already have an experiment underway, so let's pay attention and do the experiment as well as we can.
So maybe asking ourselves, those of us who are willing to entertain this question, you know, what do we like better about the way we're living now? And obviously the essential workers they're being asked to do too much, and some of us are being asked to do too little, and that should be an equal share. We should all be sharing in that work. But, you know, what do we like better about this? How could we imagine the world being like this indefinitely, and what would it end up if it continued like this indefinitely, except we got to talk with our neighbors, you know, that restriction wasn't there anymore. But if there was no more manufacturing, or it was very limited, and we weren't importing these, you know, machines from other countries and other states and whatnot, I mean, that doesn't look like a horrible future. Some people that I've seen online, even younger people in their 20s, are saying, you know, this is a future in this direction is really not bad. It's actually good. I mean, we have more time with family, we have more time with neighbors, we have more time outside, we have time in the garden. What do you think about that?
Yeah, and we're seeing communities actually take charge of their own destiny in a way that wasn't the case before. In many cases, they're being forced to. States are banding together and finding ways to do things without having to wait for the federal government to do things for them. Well, of course, partly that's a failure of the federal government. Okay, things in many ways, things could be handled a lot better. But given the failure of the federal government, the devolution of authority and agency to the state and local level is an interesting, again, it's part of this experiment we're running. And it's a really interesting experiment to see what happens. So how can we do this really well? How can we at the state and local level, you know, engage and adapt in a way that, as you say, makes things better?
Well, again, thank you so much, Richard, for being with us on the call again. Can you just remind us of a little bit how to read some of your blogs and things, and Post Carbon Institute and whatnot?
Sure. My personal website is richardheinberg.com, and all of my essays stretching back for many years are archived there, including very recent ones. But all of my stuff gets posted at resilience.org, which is Post Carbon Institute's sort of main website. We also have an institutional website, postcarbon.org, but it's a lot more interesting to go to resilience.org because it's all daily updated essays and postings from all over the world on ideas, thoughts, analysis related to all the things we've been talking about.
And if you appreciate content like this on the internet, then please support the creators like Richard and myself. Please subscribe and click the bell so you get notifications so when stuff comes up, and put a like, put a comment, share, especially if you found something in here that was useful. And if you have an idea for a future question, a future person to interview, put that in there as well. Thank you so much. Remember that freedom is power, but only if shared. Love is unbounded, but only if freed. And we are all one. Thank you so much again, Richard.
Yeah. Thank you, Aaron.
Bye-bye.